Hi guys, welcome to my channel and thanks for watching my videos. Tonight, we're diving into the deliciously questionable world of ancient Roman street food. A realm where survival, social status, and flavor all collided in a single mystery sausage. Picture the chaotic thermopolia. Greasy, bustling counters carved from stone with bubbling pots of whatever managed to survive the morning. Think of it as an ancient Taco Bell, only with more marble and far fewer food regulations. Before we get into it, feel free to like the video and subscribe if you actually enjoy this kind of content, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is. It's always fascinating to see where this strange journey is reaching people. Now, imagine this. You're trudging through a sun-baked Roman street in worn sandals, your tunic clinging in all the wrong places, head pounding from 5 too many watered-down wines and poor choices at the bathhouse. A formal meal is out of the question. You need something fast, greasy, and low on questions. Enter the thermopolium. No menus, no labels, just large earthenware pots, called dolia, sunk into stone counters, filled with mystery stews, sizzling, cheese balls, and sausages that may be pork, or just optimism in casing form. Every bite carries the pungent ghost of garum, the fermented fish sauce that doubled as seasoning and social experiment. Cleanliness, let's not dwell. The chef probably hasn't changed tunics in days, and that ladle he's using? It's seen things. But the food is hot, salty, and just calorie-dense enough to get you through another chaotic Roman afternoon. Thermopolia were everywhere, especially in Pompeii, where nearly every block had one. Workers, students, poets, and bewildered tourists from Gaul flocked to these places, trading coins for sustenance that was fast, filling, and probably breaking several health laws. Sure, it might leave you with indigestion, but when the alternative is a cold onion, you roll the dice. Later, you're wandering through the Forum, your dignity bruised and a lentil stain blooming on your toga, when your stomach growls again. You need a snack, not a meal. Something to gnaw on while pretending to care about yet another rant on wheat subsidies. That's when you hear the calls of the chickpea vendors. Caesar Arietinum, if you want to sound fancy. Roasted over coals, salted like the sea, and sold by the handful in clay bowls or cloth pouches. These chickpeas were crunchy enough to chip a molar and popular enough to be eaten by soldiers, senators, and children alike. There was no chili lime version, no hummus on the side, just salt, heat, and the illusion of health benefits like vitality, digestion, and deep thoughts. Every now and then, you'd get a soft one and think, not bad. Then you'd bite the next and remember Roman dentistry hadn't been invented yet. But for a few coins, it was the perfect snack. Portable, eternal, and useful as both food and missile in a heated gladiator debate. And then, finally, your stomach cries out for something sweet, something soft, something that won't challenge your teeth or your worldview. You spot a vendor holding a tray of golden, glistening orbs. He winks and offers you a globulus. These were no Renaissance fair gimmick. They were real Roman indulgences. Cheese balls made from soft ricotta-like curds, mixed with flour, deep fried, to a crisp, then drenched in honey until they shimmered with sticky decadence. The Romans may have been chaotic, unregulated, and occasionally insane with their food choices, but when it came to street snacks, they knew how to keep things interesting, addictive, and just a little dangerous. They were sweet, savory, and structurally unstable. Bite into a globulus too quickly and you'd risk launching hot cheese across the room. The honey would instantly glue your fingers together, ensuring the rest of your day involved bees, stray dogs, or awkward hand gestures at passing senators. But despite the stickiness, and perhaps because of it, globuli were a hit. The recipe appears in Apicius, the closest thing the Romans had to a cookbook, and they were a crowd-pleasing treat suitable for dinner parties, temple festivals, or wooing someone with a sweet tooth and questionable standards. Texture-wise, they were crispy on the outside, molten within, cheese lava wrapped in fried dough. The taste? Imagine cheesecake, but if it had a temper and came with a warning label. Romans didn't believe in restraint, especially when it came to honey, and these deep-fried cheese balls soaked in it were practically candied cannonballs. Though not your average street snack, they required oil, cheese, and some finesse. Globuli were regular features at upscale gatherings. Picture a toga party ending with guests happily groaning, tunics stained with cheese grease, and bees hovering, like tiny airborne waiters. One bite could be heavenly, or it could send you sprinting to the nearest fountain to rinse your fingers. There was no middle ground. Eventually, you might crave something a little more refined, less molten chaos, more quiet dignity. Enter the Roman answer to gourmet dessert, dates stuffed with nuts, or dulia domestica, as found in the recipes of Aius. These seemingly simple sweets were sticky, rustic, and packed with unexpected weight. You'd take a ripe, squishy date, remove the pit, stuff it with chopped almonds or walnuts, and then either drizzle, roll, or drown it in honey, depending on how rich or shameless you were. At first glance, they looked innocent enough, like the kind of treat you'd give your grandmother. But beware. These little bundles were dense, densely packed, densely flavored, and if left in the sun too long, dense enough to crack a tooth. While the elite flaunted them at banquets, even slaves and workers might enjoy dried dates during festivals, where indulgence was momentarily encouraged and digestive consequences politely ignored. Each bite was an enthusiastic experience. The chewy date, the crunch of nuts, the honey acting as both flavor and glue. They stuck to everything. Your teeth, your toga, your pride. Still, they were nutritious, high in sugar and energy with enough protein from the nuts to pass as wholesome. And they traveled well, making them perfect as gifts, battlefield rations, or edible apologies. Sweet, sticky, and slightly dangerous. These were Rome's beloved dessert grenades. But if you're ready for something truly unhinged, let's talk about stuffed dormice. Yes, actual mice. Small, fuzzy, wide-eyed rodents, raised not as pets but as delicacies for the Roman elite. Commoners stuck to lentils and boiled onions, but if you were wealthy, literary, and landowning, you probably served dormice at your dinner parties. These weren't wild-caught either. They were fattened in special terracotta jars called gleraria, which were essentially mouse-sized gyms with no exit. Once plump, they'd be stuffed with minced pork, herbs, and nuts, then roasted, dipped, in honey, or both, because moderation wasn't really a Roman virtue. Guests would pick them up delicately, pretending not to notice the tail. The flavor was supposedly nutty, but that sounds suspiciously like a euphemism for taste like regret. Yet dormouse farming was legal and even regulated, a testament to how common this culinary oddity became. They were the foie gras of the Roman world, lavish, controversial, and morally ambiguous. Why did they eat them? Because they could, because it impressed guests, because in a culture that served flamingo tongues, a honey-glazed dormouse was practically tame. After all that madness, you might finally want something comforting, golden, sweet, and ideally not looking back at you. Enter the libum, or Roman, honey cake. But don't expect a light, fluffy sponge. These cakes were dense, weighty, and more like sweet bricks than pastries. Recipes typically included cheese, flour, and egg, formed into a thick dough, shaped into loaves, and baked on bay or fig leaves, because nothing says ancient authenticity like leafy bakeware. Once out of the oven, they were not drizzled, but thoroughly drenched in honey, the kind of sticky flood that ended friendships if someone took the last slice. Honey was sacred in Rome, used as sweetener, preservative, and skin treatment, and it was the go-to solution for making questionable baked goods delicious. The result was a tangy, cheesy, honey-soaked dessert that clung to your fingers and your social reputation. Libum appeared at religious festivals, family gatherings, and as offerings to the household gods, meaning your breakfast pastry could double as spiritual tribute. As with all things Roman, class dictated ingredients. Poor households used barley, or rye with watered-down honey, while the wealthy added nuts, spices, and an irresponsible amount of sweetness. Still, these cakes were beloved, nostalgic, fought over, and hoarded like edible gold. Now, imagine waking up in ancient Rome with a headache, your neighbor yelling about overdue amphorae, and a mouth like a gravel pit. You're broke, groggy, and late. Naturally, your breakfast isn't eggs or fruit. It's soapy in venom, stale bread soaked in wine. It sounds elegant in Latin, but really, it was Roman cereal minus the milk, sugar, or joy. You'd tear hardened bread into chunks and drown it in whatever wine-adjacent liquid you had on hand. It wasn't pretty or delicious, but it made hard bread chewable and mornings survivable. In true Roman fashion, it wasn't about indulgence, it was about efficiency. And sometimes, that's all you could ask for from breakfast in a city where your other option was boiled onion or leftover mouse. Red or white didn't matter. If it had fermented grapes in it and was vaguely liquid, it was going in. Occasionally, people added herbs or honey, but that were for special occasions, or if you were trying to impress someone who'd already seen you eat mice. It was a breakfast of necessity and efficiency. Farmers ate it before a day in the fields. Laborers ate it before hauling bricks in the sun. Philosophers ate it while pretending not to cry in public. If coffee jumped to start's modern civilization, this was Rome's lukewarm, wine-flavored equivalent. Of course, the elite mocked it while secretly indulging in their own versions using aged wine, honeyed bread, and the smug expression of someone pretending to slum it for the experience. But for the average Roman, this was the real start to the day, and here's the twist. Sometimes it wasn't even breakfast. Some people just dipped bread in wine constantly during meals, during speeches, during casual eavesdropping. In the Forum, it was a food, a drink, and a lifestyle choice. Was it nutritious? Barely. Was it dignified? Not especially. But it was soft, cheap, and soaked in alcohol, which in ancient Rome qualified as a win. Ah, sausages, humanity's age-old solution to the eternal question, what do we do with the leftover bits? And nowhere was this meat wrangling more enthusiastically embraced than in ancient Rome, where sausage-making was less about recipes and more about pushing the boundaries of what could legally be considered food, the Roman version. Lucanica, a sausage named after the region of Lucania. Though by the time it hit the stalls of Rome, nobody really cared about geography. What they cared about was that it was salty, greasy, spicy, and suspiciously chewy. Ingredients, well, that's where things get exciting. Lucanica was often a delightful mystery of pork trimmings, liver lungs, heart, and possibly things best left undocumented. Seasoned with pepper cumin, fennel seeds, and a dash of bravado, it was then stuffed into an intestine casing and grilled, fried, or smoked to mask the existential horror within, and Romans loved them. Street vendors grilled them openly on small braziers, releasing clouds of meaty perfume into the already chaotic city air. People would line up toga, askew coins, in hand, waiting for their hot, greasy fix. Athletes ate them for energy. Philosophers ate them and then questioned their own ethics. Children begged for them and immediately regretted it. Of course, sausage quality varied wildly. The ones at imperial feasts might be finely ground and delicately spiced. The ones on the street, let's just say the less you asked, the happier you were. There were rumors of donkey bits, maybe dog, certainly organs you've never seen on a butcher's chart. Storage was also optimistic refrigeration. Didn't exist. And smoking meat was more art than science. So some sausages aged like fine wine. Others aged like something you'd report to the authorities. Still, they were everywhere, sold at Thermopolia, eaten at arenas, carried into battle. A Roman soldier marching across Gaul could count on two things: sore feet and a dried sausage in his pouch. It was calorie-dense flavor, rich and durable enough to double as a self-defense weapon if necessary. Let's talk about Roman pancakes, or as they might have called them, flat disappointment with a drizzle of hope. In theory, a lateria sounds promising. It translates to another sweet and was essentially a basic pancake made from spelt flour, eggs, and milk. Sometimes honey got involved, sometimes not. And that inconsistency alone tells you exactly what kind of emotional roller coaster this food was. You'd mix the batter, pour it into a pan over a fire that may or may not be cooperating, and let the magic happen. Except Roman magic didn't involve fluffy stacks or maple syrup. These pancakes were thin, dense, and just sturdy enough to qualify as edible flooring. If you were lucky, they'd be fried in a bit of oil and served with a generous helping of honey. Maybe a sprinkle of poppy seeds if someone was feeling festive. If you weren't lucky, you got the version with no toppings, no sweetness, and the texture of a legal document. Still, they were popular, cheap, easy to make, and surprisingly versatile. They could be sweet or savory. Eaten, hot or cold, served at festivals. Funerals and that awkward space between breakfast and guilt. Romans weren't looking for a breakfast revolution. They just wanted calories that didn't bite back. But make no mistake. If you're imagining a modern pancake with strawberries and whipped cream, adjust your expectations downward immediately. These were the kind of cakes that required strong teeth and low emotional standards, more fuel than food, more endurance snack than indulgent brunch. Yet they had their place. They filled stomachs. They paired decently with wine. They made you feel, however briefly, that you had some control over your life, which in a world of invasions, political backstabbing, and mystery meat sausages was no small comfort. And sometimes, just sometimes, the batter would crisp just right on the edges. The honey would caramelize and you'd think, this is almost good. That fleeting joy was the Roman pancake's true legacy, setting the bar low enough to be pleasantly surprised. So were they blandies? Were they adored? Somehow also, yes. Because in Rome, even mediocrity had its moment. Preferably served with honey, there's a certain honesty in Roman cuisine. They didn't pretend things were fancy. They didn't trim the fat. And when it came to fish, they certainly didn't waste time with tidy fillets or delicate portions. No, they went straight for the bits, fried, salty sometimes, unrecognizable, always crunchy. Imagine this: you're wandering the docks of Ostia, or maybe just downwind from a fishmonger in the Subura. You catch a whiff of something sizzling, something fishy, something that's probably been sitting out since sunrise. You see it follow your nose, and there it is. A greasy tray of fried fish parts lovingly coated in oil and what might be flour or might be street dust. No one's sure anymore. What were you getting exactly? Well, fish heads, tails, fins, and anything small enough to toss whole into a pan. Anchovies were a favorite sardine stew. Occasionally, the Romans would venture into mystery seafood territory and fry whatever creature happened to flop into the net that day. The cooking method was simple. Heat up some oil, toss fish in, and hope they crisp before they burn. Sprinkle with salt, maybe a squirt of vinegar if you were feeling aristocratic. Serve it wrapped in a fig leaf, or straight into the customer's hand if hygiene was optional. Which, let's be honest, it usually was. These little crunchy sea creatures were everywhere. Thermopolia served them. Market stalls shouted about them. Kids bought them as snacks. And everyone knew if it's been fried hard enough, you don't have to ask what part of the fish it was. Nutritionally, decent omega-3s, protein, calcium from the bones. You were absolutely crunching through, and a lingering scent of the Mediterranean that stayed with you for days. But here's the magic. People loved it. Romans weren't looking for elegance, they wanted salt, fat, and crunch. And these fish bits delivered loudly greasily in a way that told your stomach, yes, I'm full, and told your dignity, we don't talk about this. By now, you've eaten bread, soaked in wine sausage stuffed with mystery, and a pancake that legally qualifies as a construction material. Maybe you're craving something wholesome, something fruity, something that says, I made a good life decision today. Enter the Roman fig cake, or as some modern historians like to call it, the ancient art of making leftovers look intentional. Figs were everywhere in Rome, abundant, cheap, and so perishable that Romans had roughly 3 hours between ripe and fermented. So, what did they do with the extras? They smashed them into fig cakes, little lumps of mashed fig, sometimes mixed with nuts or flour, occasionally shaped into discs, and almost always passed off as dessert. The texture was ambitious, chewy, sticky, and vaguely alarming if stored improperly. The taste that depended on how long the figs had been sitting in the sun. Best case scenario, rich and naturally sweet. Worst case, a tangy flavor profile one could charitably call surprising. Sometimes they added honey, which helped. Sometimes they didn't, which didn't. Some versions included sesame seeds, creating a snack that stuck to your ears like emotional baggage. Others were wrapped in leaves for easy portability and plausible deniability, but despite their humble beginnings, fig cakes were popular across all classes. Farmers brought them into the fields. Philosophers nibbled them while judging other philosophers. Even the rich liked them, though theirs came adorned with spices and smugness. In festivals, they were often handed out to crowds like ancient granola bars, and because they didn't spoil easily, they became the go-to offering for God's house spirits and the tone neighbor you didn't like, but had to stay polite with. Let's not pretend they were glamorous. Nobody was writing love poems to fig cakes, but they were dense, nutritious, and endlessly adaptable. The culinary equivalent of it'll do. And let's face it, in a society where most desserts either stuck to your hands or tried to escape your plate, the humble fig cake offered a rare kind of stability. It didn't sparkle, it didn't impress, but it also didn't fight back. And sometimes that's enough. At this point in your Roman culinary journey, you've eaten enough fermented, fried, and honey-drenched material to question your life choices. But don't worry, we haven't yet explored one of Rome's most cherished obsessions: cheese. Specifically, cheese snacks. The kind that could be delightful or instantly regrettable. Cheese in ancient Rome wasn't just a food, it was a philosophy. They had soft cheese, hard cheese, aged cheese, and the kind of cheese that might count as a biological weapon by modern standards. Romans loved to snack on cheese between meals, or more accurately, between other questionable decisions. Let's start with fried cheese patties, a common treat at thermopolia and taverns. These were made by mashing soft cheese, likely a ricotta-like curd, mixing it with flour or semolina, forming little discs and frying them in oil until golden. Sounds tasty. Right, it was, but only if eaten hot. Let them cool for 5 minutes, and you were suddenly gnawing on something with the texture of an old sandal. Some were sweetened with honey. Others had herbs and were aggressively savory. Occasionally someone would throw in nuts or dried fruits, which in theory sounded inventive, but often ended up tasting like someone accidentally dropped trail mix into a grilled cheese. Now, if you were particularly unlucky, you might encounter aged Roman cheese. This wasn't your delicate French brie or polite cheddar. No, this was hard, pungent, and frequently described as fragrant, which is ancient cook for don't inhale too. Deeply, some versions were aged until they were more salt than cheese. Others were stored in baskets left. out in the sun and possibly used to repel unwanted guests. Cheese snacks were everywhere, served to soldiers offered at festivals, even gifted during Saturnalia because nothing says, "I appreciate you," like a block of dairy that could double as a paper. They were filling cheap and impressively shelf-stable, assuming you didn't mind them fighting back, but for all their inconsistencies, the Romans adored cheese snacks. They were comforting portable, and only occasionally threatening. In short, they were the mozzarella sticks of the ancient world, just without mozzarella or sticks. Some civilizations have ketchup. Others have hot sauce. Ancient Rome, they had garum, the fermented fish sauce that somehow ended up in or near just about every edible object in the empire. Let's be clear, garum was not subtle. It was not elegant. It was not something you lightly drizzled. It was fermented. Fish juice made by stuffing fish guts into clay pots, adding copious salt, and then leaving the entire mixture to sit in the sun until it stopped screaming. The result, a brown, oily, salty, tangy liquid that Romans poured over meats, vegetables, grains, and yes, snacks, bread dipped in garum. Absolutely roasted nuts with garum. Why not fried cheese with a splash of garum? You're living dangerously, but that's Roman cuisine for you, and it wasn't just for taste. Garum had social clout. There were different grades, some for the poor and others so exclusive they were aged longer than your average gladiator liquaman Alec, and other variations were sold across the empire with labels boasting origins, purity, and probably imaginary health benefits. Think of it as the ancient Roman version of organic artisanal soy sauce, but with more intestines. Now it should be noted that the smell of garum production was so bad, it was legally restricted to outside city limits. That's right, even in Rome, where sewage flowed freely and public baths were occasionally experimental at best garum, factories were banned from the neighborhood. But once bottled and shipped, it was gold. Emperors hoarded it. Cooks swore by it. Hungry citizens slathered it on nearly anything that didn't move. It was Rome's favorite flavor bomb and its most widely tolerated. A lactory crime. Did people actually enjoy it? Apparently, yes, they praised it in poems. They included it in cookbooks. They wrote love letters to recipes that began with "First drown everything in garum." Was it healthy? Possibly. Was it overwhelming? Always. Did it add something magical to fried street snacks? If you like your magic strong, fishy, and vaguely suspicious, then yes. So when you imagine Roman junk food, don't just picture cheese balls or fig cakes. Picture cheese balls and fig cakes soaked in fermented fish sauce. Because that's what winning tasted like in Rome. You still crave a snack, something casual, something crunchy, something you can eat with one hand while waving the other dramatically at passing senators. Enter Roman street nuts. Walk through any bustling Roman marketplace, the Forum, the port at Ostia, the back alleys of Subura, and you'd hear the unmistakable sound of nuts roasting on open coals. Not in the cozy holidays scented way, more like the smell of burning street cart mixed with salted temptation. Your choices: almonds, walnuts, hazelnuts, and pine nuts, though the latter could cost a small fortune and possibly your dignity if you dropped them. Most were roasted, lightly salted and sometimes flavored with herbs. Or honey simple. Addictive, pocket-friendly vendors sold them in little paper cones made of recycled wax tablets or papyrus scraps, which occasionally still had grocery lists or bad poetry scribbled on them, bonus entertainment. And the Romans, they went nuts for nuts. Philosophers munched them while pondering mortality. Gladiators downed them for protein. Drunken party guests tossed them into mouths and sometimes amphe with varying degrees of accuracy. Even the emperors snacked on them, though theirs were peeled, gilded, and likely carried to theme on a silver platter by someone with anxiety. Some were even candied, Almonds coated in honey were the closest thing Rome had to peanut brittle, and they were equally capable of cracking a tooth or winning your affection, depending on how fresh they were. Of course, there were downsides. Overeating nuts, especially the garum-dusted kind, could lead to indigestion, social consequences, and dramatic readings of your last will and testament. But that didn't stop anyone, because street nuts were fast, cheap, and deeply satisfying. They were the original Roman vending machine. Insert a coin, receive crunchy joy. No fuss, no mystery meat. No tales, just a handful of salty delight in a city powered by wine ambition and low-grade chaos. You've partied like a senator. You've bathed in wine, sung badly at a Satania feast. Maybe kissed someone who turned out to be your cousin's slave. It's the morning after your toga's on sideways. Your mouth tastes like garum and questionable. Life choices. You need help. But in Rome, help doesn't come in the form of aspirin or black coffee. No, what you get is a heroic medicinal snack and the vague hope that Jupiter still loves you. Enter hangover food. Roman edition, first up is the cure. All wine-soaked bread. Yes again. Because what better way to fix a wine-induced disaster than with more wine now? Absorbed into a stale loaf, Sodri it threatens to exfoliate your gums. Or maybe you're handed a raw egg stirred into spiced wine, known as pusca ovata. Think of it as a protein shake, minus refrigeration, hygiene, or joy. Slug it down and try not to gag while someone older than the Republic insists. It restores your humors. Still woozy, time for a snack platter from Etruscan hell olives. Garlic vinegar-soaked onions, and maybe a bite of pickled fish, because nothing clears the sinuses like salty brine and regret. One famous option, fried cabbage with cumin and oil. Supposedly miraculous, realistically greasy pungent, and likely to start. More problems than it solves, Roman doctors swore by it. Roman diners mostly swore at it. There were also sweet options. Figs with honey and vinegar, or dates soaked in wine and dusted with pepper. These, to be fair, probably did help. They were sugary, hydrating, and just weird enough to distract you from your headache. And if all else failed, you could always go full Gladiator A, handful of barley Arowonian, and a punch to the chest to wake you up. No science, just confidence and shame. Of course, Romans didn't call it a hangover, they called it being troubled in the head, which frankly sounds more accurate. And while their cures were hit or miss, they believed in them. With the same fervor, they believed fried dormice were classy. So there you are, hunched over a thermopolium counter, sipping spiced vinegar and chewing cabbage while praying. To Bacchus for mercy. Welcome to recovery. Roman style, before he was the scourge of Rome. Before elephants thundered over the Alps, Hannibal Barker was just a boy, wide-eyed, sharp-minded, and already forged in the fire of revenge. The year is around 237. B. C.E. Carthage. The once proud North African power has just lost the First Punic War to Rome. And the man nursing that wound deeper than anyone else. Hamilar Bassa, the boy's father, he wasn't just a general. He was a symbol of Carthaginian resilience. Fierce, brilliant, and bitterly humiliated by Rome's victory, and he wasn't done fighting. So when Hamilar prepared to leave for Iberia, what we now call Spain, to rebuild Carthage's strength and carve out a new empire, he took his 9-year-old son with him, but this wasn't a bonding trip. This was indoctrination. Before they departed, legend says Herlar brought Hannibal to the temple of Baal and had him place his tiny hand on a bloody sacrificial altar. There, he made his son swear a sacred oath that he would never be a friend to Rome, not tolerate no tenure, never be a friend. Think about that. Not many kids are raised with mathsword play and a lifelong vendetta as their school subjects, but Hannibal wasn't raised like other kids. His classroom was a war camp. His father was his general, and his curriculum was revenge. As they marched into Iberia, Hannibal watched and learned. He saw his father win brutal battles, form shaky alliances, and conquer territory mile by mile. Every Roman ambassador that came sniffing around Hannibal studied every negotiation that fell through every Carthaginian soldier who bled on foreign soil. He remembered it. By the time Hemlardite and command passed to Hannibal's brother-in-law, Hasdrubal, the boy was already hardened. When Hasdrubal was assassinated. Years later, Hannibal, now 26, was voted by the army to take command, not the Senate, not the elders, the soldiers, the ones who had seen him grow up, fight, and lead. And in that moment, the oath of a child hardened into the mission. Of a man, Rome may have won the first round, but Hannibal Barca was about to change everything they thought they knew about warfare and about fear. Hannibal didn't wait to warm the commander's seat. The moment he took control of the Carthaginian forces. In Iberia, he unleashed a campaign so brutal, so effective that it would make Rome twitch from across the sea. He began with the tribes of Hispania fractured proud and constantly at each other's throats. Instead of marching in like a conqueror, Hannibal used diplomacy, marriage alliances, and bribery to win some of them over. For the rest, he used steel tribes that resisted were crushed with a mix of battlefield brilliance and psychological warfare. Hannibal didn't just fight battles, he staged them. He'd allow one part of his army to feign retreat, only to flank and surround the enemy once they thought they were winning. He played mines as easily as he played swords, and the soldiers loved him for it. Hannibal shared their food, marched alongside them, and fought in the thick of combat. He wasn't some pampered general watching from a gilded chariot. He bled with them, he inspired loyalty, the same way he inspired fear in huge, overwhelming doses. As Carthage's power grew in Iberia, Rome began to feel the pressure. They had signed a treaty with Hasdrubal before his death, which said Carthage wouldn't cross the Ebro River, but Hannibal wasn't interested in Roman paperwork. He had a much bigger game in mind. So he targeted the city of Sagunum, a Roman ally just south of the Ebro. Attacking it wasn't just bold, it was practically a declaration of war. Rome watched nervously, unsure if Carthage would restrain this ambitious young general. Spoiler alert, they didn't. The siege of Sagunum was brutal and efficient. Hannibal starved them, bombarded their walls, and finally overran the city. Survivors were either killed or sold into slavery. Rome had its answer. Hannibal wasn't bluffing, and he wasn't afraid. The Roman Senate was outraged, of course. They demanded Carthage hand over Hannibal for violating the treaty. Carthage's response, a collective shrug. The Senate debated. The nobles bickered, but no one had the guts or perhaps the desire to rein him in. Hannibal had become bigger than Carthage. Now, with Iberia under his belt and Rome fuming across the sea, he turned his eyes toward Italy. Not by ship, not through a polite declaration of war, but by doing the impossible. He would bring the war to Rome's doorstep, and he would do it with elephants. When Hannibal announced his plan to invade Italy, not by sea, not by treaty, but by land, through the Alps, his officers thought he had lost his mind. The Alps weren't just mountains, they were death traps, snow-covered, treacherous, crawling with hostile tribes. No son, general, would attempt it, especially not with thousands of soldiers, pack animals, and a handful of African war elephants. But Hannibal wasn't aiming for sanity, he was aiming for shock and awe. In 218 CE, he began the most daring military maneuver. In ancient history, with an army of around 50,000 men and 37 elephants, Hannibal marched north from Iberia, crossing the Pyrenees, skirmishing with Celtic tribes, and eventually reaching the Rhone River. There, he used rafts and local guides to ferry his elephants across elephants on rafts. The logistics alone were insane. Rome was caught flat-footed. They expected him to come by sea, or at worst through the expected coastal routes, but Hannibal was rewriting the rule book, and he hadn't even reached the Alps yet. When they finally began the Alpine ascent, everything that could go wrong did. Landslides buried equipment, snow blinded the troops, altitude, sickness, freezing winds, and starvation killed thousands. Supplies ran low. Morale plummeted. Men began to desert. Elephants slipped on the icy paths and plummeted into ravines. One soldier reportedly had to chisel frozen horse hooves free from icy rock with a pickaxe, but Hannibal kept moving. He rallied his men by pointing to the distant plains of Italy, promising them rich farmland plunder and revenge against Rome. He used fire to shatter ice vinegar to weaken rock and sheer will to drag his army over nature's deadliest obstacles. After 2 harrowing weeks barely alive and with fewer than half his original force, Hannibal emerged on the other side into the Po Valley, exhausted, frostbitten, and battered. But in Italy and Rome, they were horrified. They had never imagined an enemy would knock on their door in such fashion. The Alps weren't supposed to be crossed, let alone with elephants. But Hannibal had done it. It wasn't just a march, it was a message. Rome isn't safe. Nowhere is I'm here. And he wasn't planning on leaving anytime soon. Hannibal didn't waste time once he hit Italian soil. Even with a diminished force, he immediately began recruiting discontented GIC tribes in northern Italy, Rome's enemies, and they joined him. Because Hannibal didn't just promise liberation, he proved it with blood. Rome, stunned but still arrogant, scrambled to send legions to intercept him. Consul Gaius Flaminius took command, burning with the confidence of the Republic. He wanted a swift victory, a glorious one that would restore Roman pride after Hannibal's ridiculous Alpine stunt. But Hannibal had already chosen his battlefield, and it wasn't going to be glorious for anyone in a red cloak. The place was Lake Tresmain, a foggy narrow valley with water on one side and steep hills on the other, perfect for an ambush. Hannibal stationed his infantry in front, clearly visible like bait. Huthan concealed his cavalry and elite troops in the hills hidden in the early morning mist. On June 21st, 217 B. Flaminius charged in, eager, overconfident, and completely blind to what was coming. As the Romans advanced into the trap, Hannibal sprang the jaws shut. His troops exploded from the hills, slamming into the Roman flanks. Cavalry cut off retreat. The Roman line stretched thin in the narrow pass had nowhere to maneuver. It was chaos. Roman soldiers drowned in the lake were trampled trying to flee, or slaughtered. Where they stood, Flaminius himself was cut down, trying to rally his collapsing army. In just a few hours, 15,000 Romans were dead, thousands more captured. And Hannibal, he didn't lose a single officer. The ambush at Lake Trime became the largest and most successful ambush in military history. Rome panicked. Streets filled with screams and prayers. Mothers wept. The Senate, in despair, appointed a dictator, Quintus Fabius Maximus, to deal with the crisis. But Hannibal wasn't finished. He had invaded their land, annihilated their legions, and now he roamed Italy like a ghost. Impossible, toe-catch, devastating, everything in his path. Yet even after this disaster, Rome refused to negotiate. That was fine with Hannibal. He didn't want peace. He wanted to humiliate them. In the one place they thought themselves invincible on the battlefield at the heart of their empire, and his deadliest masterpiece was still to come. If Lake Tresmae was Hannibal's masterpiece of ambush, then Cana was his symphony of annihilation. 216 B. C. Rome was done playing cautious, no more waiting, no more defensive strategies. They massed the largest army they had ever fielded, around 80,000 men under the command of consuls Lucius Aelius Pallas and Gaius Terentius Varro, twice the size of Hannibal's army. They weren't planning to outwit him. They were planning to crush him with sheer force. Hannibal knew it and smiled. He chose the battlefield, a wide plain near the town of Cannae in southern Italy, perfect for cavalry movement and maneuvering. Then he arranged his troops in a deceptively simple formation. His weakest infantry, mostly Gauls and Spaniards, formed a shallow crescent to the center. His stronger African infantry waited on the flanks. His cavalry, his real hammer, flanked even wider on both sides. The trap was set. On the morning of battle, the Romans advanced in a dense, powerful column, eager to punch straight through Hannibal's center. And they did. At first, Hannibal's crescent began to bend inward under pressure, retreating but not breaking. The Roman infantry surged forward deeper and deeper into the trap, thinking victory was near. That's when the jaws snapped shut. Hannibal's African infantry on the flanks wheeled inward, enveloping the Romans from both sides. His cavalry, having already routed, the Roman horsemen circled back and attacked from the rear. Now the Romans were surrounded completely. No retreat, no breathing room, just chaos and blood. In the blazing August heat, men suffocated in the crush of bodies. Swords couldn't swing. Panic set in, and Hannibal's men systematically slaughtered them, cutting them down in one of the most lopsided massacres in military history. An estimated 50,000 and 70,000 Romans died in a single day, more than the entire population of many ancient cities. It was the worst defeat Rome had ever suffered and remains one of the deadliest battles of all time. And Hannibal. He didn't march on Rome not because he couldn't, but because he knew Rome would not fall easily. He needed reinforcements from Carthage, siege equipment, and time. But Carthage hesitated. Even after handing Rome its darkest day, Hannibal stood alone. And Rome, wounded, vengeful, and now very afraid, wasn't planning on letting him go unpunished. After Canaan, Hannibal's name alone could silence a Roman crowd. Mothers used it to frighten their children. Hannibal had Porus. Hannibal, eyes at the gates. And yet strangely, he never entered the city. For 16 years, Hannibal roamed the Italian countryside like a phantom, unbeaten, unpredictable, and completely. Without reinforcements, he won the loyalty of many southern Italian cities and brought chaos to Rome's allies. But Carthage, for all its riches, refused to send him the support he needed to finish the job. The Senate feared his growing power. His enemies, at home, whispered about his ambition. They were more comfortable letting him bleed, Rome slowly, than arming him for a final strike. So Hannibal was forced to adapt. He became a master of survival, fighting guerrilla-style skirmishes, harassing supply, lines destroying crops, and always staying just out of reach. The Romans under Fabius. Maximus, nicknamed the Delayer, refused to give battle. They shadowed him, avoiding open conflict, starving him of opportunities. But Hannibal still scored victories. He crushed Roman forces at Hardonia, ambushed them in Apulia, and even destroyed entire consular armies that dared to chase him, and he kept doing it without ever losing a major engagement. But time was turning against him. Rome, battered but relentless. Adapted. They built more legions, trained new commanders, strengthened their alliances. While Hannibal wandered with a shrinking army, Rome expanded its power like a hydra, growing new heads, and the war began to shift elsewhere. Rome invaded Iberia, cutting off Carthaginian supply lines. Hannibal's own brother, Hasdrubal, tried to bring reinforcements by crossing the Alps just like Hannibal had years before. But Rome intercepted him, crushed his army, and threw Hasdrubal's severed head into Hannibal's camp. That message was clear. You're alone. Now Hannibal's dream of breaking Rome from within was fading. He had turned Italy into a graveyard of legions. But without reinforcements, without siege engines, without political backing, he couldn't deliver the final blow. Still, he refused to leave. He had promised his father as a boy that he would be no friend to Rome, and he kept that promise every year he remained on their soil. But soon Rome would come, knocking not in Italy, but on Carthage's own shores, and Hannibal would have no choice but to go home for the final fight by 203 BCE. The tide had fully turned. Rome had clawed back from disaster, conquered Hannibal's strongholds in Iberia, and taken the fight directly to North Africa. Leading the charge was Scipio Africanus, a young brilliant general who had studied Hannibal's tactics obsessively. Rome was no longer content to wait. They wanted Carthage destroyed and to save itself. The Carthaginian Senate had to do the unthinkable. They summoned Hannibal home. After 16 years of near-mythical campaigning in Italy, Hannibal left the land he had bled for. He returned to Carthage to defend a city that had abandoned him and to face a man trained in the art of Hannibalic warfare. The final showdown came at Zamain, 202 BCE. This time, the armies were nearly evenly matched. Hannibal commanded a force of veterans' levies and 80 war elephants. Scipio, meanwhile, had disciplined Roman legions and Numidian cavalry, crucially led by Massinissa, a former Carthaginian, who had switched sides. Hannibal opened the battle with a massive elephant charge. It was meant to shatter the Roman lines. But Scipio had planned for this. He ordered his troops to part, creating corridors that funneled the elephants safely through the beasts, either panicked or passed harmlessly between the Roman ranks. Some even turned back, trampling Hannibal's own lines. What followed was a fierce infantry clash. Hannibal's veterans fought valiantly, even pushing back Rome's front lines. But when Scipio's cavalry returned from the flanks and attacked from behind, just as Hannibal had done at Cannae, the Carthaginian formation collapsed. The roles had reversed. Hannibal, once the master of encirclement, was now its victim. Carthage was forced to surrender. The terms were brutal. They had to give up their fleet, pay a massive indemnity, and promise never to wage war without Rome's permission. Hannibal had lost. But it wasn't just a military defeat. It was the death of a vision. His lifelong mission, to break Rome's grip on the Mediterranean, was shattered in the North African dust. Yet even in defeat, Rome didn't kill him. They feared him too much to make him a martyr. Instead, they let him live, knowing full well they hadn't seen the last of him. Because Hannibal Barca wasn't done making history. Not yet. Hannibal returned to Carthage not as a defeated general, but as a survivor. While Zama had broken Carthage militarily, Hannibal still commanded immense respect. The people saw him not as the man who lost the war, but as the man who nearly won it against impossible odds. So what did Hannibal do? He reinvented himself. He became a politician. Yes, the man who had once commanded elephants through the Alps now sat in the Carthaginian Senate, rooting out corruption, reforming finances, and trying to repair the shattered state. He slashed taxes, paid off debts, and revitalized Carthage's economy, quickly gaining a reputation as a brilliant if unpopular reformer. But Rome wasn't. Watching from the sidelines, they feared Hannibal's mind more than his sword. As strong Carthage, even a peaceful one, was a threat if Hannibal was at the helm. So Rome accused him falsely of conspiring with enemy states. Cornered once again, Hannibal fled. Thus began his second life, the life of a hunted. Exile. He wandered from court to court, offering his military genius to foreign kings, first to Antiochus III of the Seleucid Empire. Rome's newest rival, Hannibal, tried to rally them for another great war. But Antiochus ignored much of his advice and lost spectacularly. Rome's influence only grew. After Antiochus' defeat, Hannibal kept running. He became a ghost, drifting through Asia. Minor, pursued constantly by Roman envoys who demanded his surrender at every port. And yet, wherever he went, he left whispers, stories, fear. The name Hannibal still sent chills down Roman spines. Despite his defeats, he remained a symbol of defiance, a one-man rebellion against imperial arrogance. He couldn't raise new armies. He had no homeland, no power, just a brilliant mind, a long shadow, and enemies who never stopped watching him. By now, he was in his 60s, gay-haired, worn thin by decades of war and exile. But even then, Hannibal remained sharper than most living generals. And Rome still wasn't satisfied. They wanted him erased, not just from politics or the battlefield, but from the story. So they came for him one final time. And Hannibal, true to character, would not let them have the satisfaction. By the early 180s, B.C.E. Hannibal had become a living legend and a liability not just to Rome, but to every kingdom that dared to shelter him. He was now hiding in Bithynia, a small kingdom in Asia Minor, ruled by King Prusius athirst. Hannibal, ever the strategist, helped the king win a naval battle using a trick straight out of his playbook: catapults loaded with clay jars filled with venomous snakes launched onto enemy ships to see out chaos and fear. Even in his final years, his mind was still 2 moves ahead. But Rome didn't care about snake jars. They wanted Hannibal gone forever. They pressured Pusses, sent emissaries, and made threats. Eventually, word reached Hannibal that his sanctuary had been betrayed. Roman agents were closing in on the villa where he was hiding. He didn't run. This time, according to legend, Hannibal had long kept a vial of poison hidden in a ring carried with him as insurance. If Rome ever cornered him like an animal, he would go out on his own terms. Now, the moment had come. He reportedly wrote a short message before taking the poison. "Let us relieve the Romans from their long anxiety, since they think it too tedious a task to wait for an old man's death." Just like that, it was over. Hannibal Barca, Rome's greatest nightmare, died not on a battlefield, but in a foreign land, hunted, exiled, and alone. And yet, even in death, Rome couldn't bury him. They destroyed his city-raised Carthage decades later in the Third Punic War and salted its earth, but they never forgot him. Centuries later, Roman historians, men who should have hated him, wrote about his brilliance with awe. He had led from the front, fought against overwhelming odds, and outwitted every Roman general sent to kill him. He crossed the Alps with elephants, devastated Italy for years, and gave the greatest military machine in history a fear it would never shake. And he did it all while staying true to one thing: his boyhood oath to never be a friend to Rome. Even in exile, even in death, Hannibal won a different kind of war: the war for legacy. And in that war, he remains undefeated. Every autumn in ancient Greece, a strange transformation would grip the land between Athens and the small town of Eleusis. Roads filled with chanting pilgrims, smoke and incense drifted through the hills, and somewhere in the darkness, under torchlight and secrecy, something sacred and forbidden took place. This was the Elohenian Mysteries, the most famous and mysterious religious festival of the ancient world. It wasn't just a celebration, it was a spiritual initiation. And unlike the rowdy Dionysian orgies or the public pomp of Olympic festivals, this one came with rules, ironclad rules. Break the silence, speak of what happened inside the sacred hall, and you could be executed. The core of the festival centered around Data, the goddess of the harvest, and her daughter, Persephone. According to myth, Persephone was kidnapped by Hades, god of the underworld. Data, devastated, caused the world's crops to wither in mourning. Eventually, a deal was struck. Persephone, Annie would spend part of the year underground and part above. This myth became a powerful metaphor for the agricultural cycle: death and rebirth, decay and renewal. But the mysteries weren't just agricultural, they were cosmic. To the Greeks, this wasn't just about farming. It was about the fate of the soul, participants known as Mii. underwent a multi-day journey. They fasted. They bathed in the sea. They carried sacred objects, and then at Eleusis they entered the Telesterion, a great hall where the innermost rites took place. What exactly they saw or experienced inside is still debated. Some think it involved a symbolic reenactment of Pesphines. Return others believe it was a visionary experience, perhaps aided by a hallucinogenic potion called Kikon. Whatever it was, it left people changed, from emperors like Hadrian to philosophers like Plato. Many of the greatest minds of antiquity went through the Eleusinian mysteries and emerged convinced that death was not the end. This was religion, not as obedience, but as transformation. A sacred encounter with the cycles of life loss and renewal. For over 1,000 years, the Eleusinian mysteries endured, longer than most empires, until one day, Christianity's the old gods were outlawed and the secrets of Elis were buried forever. Noon ever broke the vow of silence, and so the mystery lives. While Greece cloaked its sacred rites in mystery, ancient Egypt preferred something far more spectacular: public religion on parade, and no festival embodied this more than the Opet festival held annually in the grand city of Thebes. The Opet festival was one of the most magnificent religious events in ancient Egypt. Its purpose to rejuvenate the pharaoh's divine essence and reaffirm his sacred bond with the gods, especially Amun-Ra, the chief deity of Thebes. It began at the colossal temple of Karnak, home to the mighty god Amun, his wife Mut, and their son Khonsu the Theban. Triad priests carried their sacred statues sealed within golden shrines onto ceremonial boats called barks. These weren't ordinary boats, they were massive, gilded, and often carried on the shoulders of dozens of priests through Thebes streets. Later, they were floated down the Nile itself. Their destination, the Luxor Temple about 2 kilometers away, linked to Kerak by a grand avenue lined with hundreds of sphinxes. The journey between the temples was not silent or solemn. It was vibrant, theatrical, and drenched in pageantry. Dancers, musicians, acrobats, and chanting priests filled the streets. Commoners came out in droves not just to watch but to participate. For many Egyptians, this was their chance to see the divine not hidden in the inner sanctums of a temple, but paraded openly, proudly, and dazzlingly through the city. And this wasn't just ritual for show. The pharaoh himself joined the procession, often taking part in sacred reenactments. In some eras, it was believed the god Amun merged spiritually with the pharaoh during the ceremony, recharging his divine mandate to rule. It was a renewal of power, not through conquest, but through cosmic approval. There was also a deeply human element. During the festival, the strict boundaries between priest and peasant, god and mortal, loosened. People feasted, drank, danced. It was joy wrapped in divinity, a moment when heaven touched earth. However briefly, the Opet festival lasted anywhere, from 11 to 27 days depending on the period and the pharaoh's budget. And while each celebration had its own flavor, the message remained the same. Egypt was in balance, the gods were pleased, and the divine order of Mahat still reigned for the Egyptians. That meant everything. If the Eleusinian mysteries were about divine secrets and the Opet festival about royal divinity, then Saturnalia was something else entirely. A week-long party where Rome gleefully abandoned its rules, held every December in honor of Saturn, the Roman god of agriculture, time, and liberation. Saturnalia was a deeply rooted festival celebrating the end of the harvest and a nostalgic longing for the mythical Golden Age, a time when Saturn ruled and all men were free and equal in hand. For a few chaotic days, Romans strayed to relive that dream. It began with a sacrifice at the Temple of Saturn, in the Forum, followed by a public feast. Then all social norms were flipped on. Their heads, masters served their slaves. Senators wore colorful tunics instead of togas. Gambling, usually banned, was openly permitted. Work stopped, schools closed, the courts shut down. Rome didn't function, at least not in the usual sense. One of the festival's most bizarre traditions was the election of a Saturnalian king, sometimes called the Lord of Misrule. This was often a low-ranking citizen, a slave, or even a child, given mock authority to issue absurd commands. Sing naked in the streets, balance a plate on your head. Obeying these ridiculous orders was part of. The fun Saturnalia was also when people exchanged gifts, wax candles, small figurines, and even poetry. It was light-hearted, full of laughter, and had a warmth that feels oddly familiar. In fact, many scholars argue that Saturnalia is one of the cultural ancestors of Christmas. The timing, the gift, giving the candles, the feasting, it all echoes through time. But Saturnalia wasn't just a holiday, it was a pressure valve for a society so rigidly structured with slaves at the bottom and senators at the top. It allowed for the illusion, however brief, that everyone was equal, that maybe, just maybe, there could be a return to Saturn's mythical golden age. Of course, when the festival ended, everything snapped back into place. Slaves returned to servitude. The Senate resumed its bickering. The streets quieted, but for that week of reversal, Rome became a theater of joy, chaos, and shared humanity. Because even an empire needs a break from pretending it has everything under control. Long before alarm clocks and New Year countdowns, ancient Persians were already celebrating a festival of rebirth, balance, and fire. One that still survives, today Novus, the Persian New Year. Rooted in Zoroastrianism. One of the world's oldest monotheistic religions, Novus wasn't just about turning a calendar page. It marked the spring equinox moment when day and night are perfectly balanced to Zoroastrians. This balance reflected the eternal struggle between Ahura Mazda, the force of light and order, and Angra Manu, darkness and chaos. No R symbolized victory of light over dark, of cleanliness over corruption, and hope over despair. Preparation began weeks in advance. Homes were swept, walls washed, debts settled. This wasn't just spring cleaning, it was a spiritual purge. Everything, dirty or chaotic, had to go. Fires were lit in courtyards and along city walls. On the eve of the new year, people would leap over flames shouting, "Give me your red color, take away my sickness." The fire sacred in Zoroastrian belief wasn't just heat and light, it was purification. Then came the hafts, table and altar-like arrangement of 7 symbolic items beginning with the Persian letter. S, sabze, sprouted greens for growth, C, garlic for protection. Sened, dried fruit for love, Siri, vinegar for wisdom, and more. Each item represented a moral or cosmic value, temples called fire temples. Held special ceremonies during this period, Zoroastrian priests in white robes chanted hymns from the Avesta, their holy texts, and offered fragrant woods to the ever-burning sacred flame. For believers, it was a time to reflect, to realign with truth usher, and to embrace the turning of the cosmic wheel. But no, Ru wasn't just solemn. It was joyous families. Gathered tables overflowed with food, children received gifts, and musicians filled streets with drums and flutes. For a society that prized cosmic order, this was a moment when everything reset. Not just the year, but the soul. Nous outlived empires. It was celebrated by the Achaemenids, the Parthians, the Sassanids, and it continues today across Iran, Central Asia, and beyond. Few ancient religious festivals have endured this long. But then again, few are built so elegantly around something as universal, eternal as light returning to the world. In ancient Athens, worship didn't always mean incense and silence. Sometimes it meant masks, wine, and a god who knew how to throw a party. Dionysus, god of wine, fertility theater, and sacred madness, and no festival. Captured his chaotic brilliance like the great Dionysia held every spring. This festival wasn't some fringe cult celebration. It was one of the most important public events in the Athenian calendar. It honored Dionysus not through animal sacrifice or solemn chants, but through drama, tragedy, and comedy performed in his name. It began with a procession through the city. Citizens carried giant phallic symbols. Yes, really waved ivy-covered staffs and chanted hymns. As they led a statue of Dionysus to the theater of Dionysus at the foot of the Acropolis. There were flutes, dancers, and a tidal wave of wine-fueled enthusiasm. Then came the performances. Over several days, playwrights competed in a sacred contest presenting 3 tragedies and 1 satyr play each. These weren't casual shows. They were state-sponsored events judged by elite citizens and watched by up to 15,000 people at a time. Attendance was civic duty. Even prisoners could be released on bail to attend. The themes gods, fate, hubris, revenge, war, and suffering, Aeschylus, Sophocles, Euripides. These masters told stories that ripped the soul open. Imagine watching Oedipus discover. He married his mother with your neighbors beside you gasping in horror. It wasn't just entertainment, it was ritual catharsis. And after the tragedies came the comedies, raunchy political and often absurd. Aristophanes used them to mock politicians, question war, and skewer society itself. Nothing was off limits. But at its core, Dionysia was about more than theater. It was about stepping out of yourself, about breaking down the mask society. Forces us to wear and putting on literal ones to explore truths we couldn't otherwise say aloud. It was madness with meaning. Dionysus wasn't a calm, orderly god. He was wild, untamed, a bridge between civilization and its primal roots. The Dionysia gave space for that side of humanity to breathe, shout, laugh, and grieve. For the Athenians, this wasn't escape. This was religion, a mirror held up to the soul with a wine cup in hand, and the god of ecstatic transformation watching from the wings among ancient. Religious festivals, few, are as raucous, theatrical, and subversively spiritual as Purim, a Jewish holiday that's part survival story, part political satire, and all about divine irony. Purim commemorates the events told in the Book of Esther, set in the Persian Empire under King Ahasuerus, likely Xerxes, you. The plot sounds almost like a drama from the great Dionysia. A Jewish girl named Esther becomes queen, hides her identity, and eventually risks her life to stop a genocidal plot by the king's advisor, Haman, to annihilate the Jews. She succeeds. Haman is hanged on his own gallows, and the Jewish people are saved. It's a story about reversal of fate, the hidden workings of providence, and the power of courage. But unlike solemn religious festivals, Purim is pure, unfiltered joy, a celebration of survival that leans into laughter and liberation. The festival begins with the public reading of the Megillah Book of Esther, often performed like a comedic play. Every time Haman's name is mentioned, the crowd drowns it out with graggers, noisemakers, boos, and shouting. Children dress up as Esther Moray, or even Chman. Costumes and chaos are encouraged. Then come the commandments of celebration, feasting with lavish meals, gifting food to friends, giving to the poor, and most famously drinking until you can't distinguish between blessed is Mordei and cursed is Haman. Yes, that's actually written in the Talmud. But behind the festivity lies something profound. Unlike other Jewish holidays, God is never mentioned. by name in the book of Esther. Not once. It's the only book in the Hebrew Bible with that distinction. This absence forces readers to look for hidden divine intervention, a lesson in faith without direct revelation. Purim teaches that even when miracles don't look like parted seas or fire from heaven, they can still unfold behind palace doors through courage, risk, and unlikely heroes. So people celebrate with parody masks, satire, and storytelling. They laugh in the face of death. They mock the villain, and in doing so they affirm something deeply spiritual. Survival is sacred, and joy is resistance. In the misty hills and forested valleys of ancient Ireland, the beginning of August marked a sacred and deeply communal event. Lugnasad, pronounced Lunasar, the Celtic festival honoring Lugh, the god of light craftsmanship and war. Unlike the grand temple festivals of Rome or Egypt, Lugnasad was celebrated outdoors on hilltops, in fields, and by sacred wells. It wasn't about imperial spectacle, it was about the land, the harvest, and the fragile bargain between humans and nature. Lugh, the namesake of the festival, was a solar deity, a shining warrior and master of all arts. But Lugnasad wasn't just about worshipping him directly, according to myth. Lugh held the first festival to honor his foster mother, Tile II, who died from exhaustion after clearing the plains of Ireland to make way for farmland. In her honor, people gathered to give thanks for the first grain harvest and to ensure the earth would continue to provide. So how did they celebrate it? Started with a ceremonial cutting of the first sheath of grain, followed by offerings to the gods and spirits of the land. This wasn't just symbolic. If the harvest failed, winter would be cruel. Gratitude and ritual were a form of spiritual insurance. But Lugnasad was also a social explosion. People traveled for miles to participate in fairs, markets, competitions, and athletic games, often referred to as the tail-tan games. A kind of mystical precursor to the Olympics. Contests included running, wrestling, horse racing, and even feats of poetry and storytelling. It was also a prime time for trial marriages. Couples could commit to a union that lasted a year and a day. If it didn't work out, they could walk away, literally by standing back to back and walking in opposite directions. The gods apparently had no issue with prenups. There were bonfires, feasting, and dancing on sacred hills. But always beneath the revelry was a humbling awareness nature gives. And nature takes Lugnasad was both a celebration and a warning, a time to enjoy the first fruits, but also to begin preparing for darker days ahead. In a world ruled by seasons, this festival marked the shift from sunlight to shadow. The wheat was in hand, but winter was already watching. In the heart of the Indian subcontinent, as winter melts into spring, an explosion of color music and fire erupts across villages, towns, and cities. It's loud, it's wild, it's sacred. This is Holi, one of the most joyful and symbolic festivals in ancient Hindu tradition. Known today for its clouds of colored powder and water fights, Holi has deep religious and mythological roots. At its core, it celebrates the victory of good over evil, the arrival of spring, and the burning away of the old to make room for renewal. The festival begins the night before the color, with Holikika Dahan, the ceremonial bonfire. Its origins lie in the myth of Prada, a devout follower of the god Vishnu and his demon father, Hiranyakashipu, who demanded to be worshipped. Instead, when Prahlada refused, his father conspired to kill him by placing him on the lap of his sister Holika, who was immune to fire. But divine justice had other plans. Holikika burned, and Prada emerged unharmed. Every year, Holika's effigy is burned in bonfires across India. The fire symbolizes the destruction of ego hatred and evil and the cleansing of the soul through light and heat, and then comes the color. The next morning, the streets transform into a living kaleidoscope. People throw gulal, vibrant, colored powders at each other, drench friends with colored water, and dance to drums and flutes. It's impossible to stay clean or somber, but this chaos is ritual. Chaos. Social boundaries collapse. Rich and poor, old and young, men and women all become equals under layers of red, green, blue, and yellow. Enemies reconcile, strangers become companions. For one day the world becomes unrecognizable, and beautifully so. Holi also connects to the legend of Krishna and Rud, where Krishna, self-conscious about his dark skin, playfully smeared color on Rud's fair face. Their divine romance became an eternal metaphor for playful love and divine unity. That's why Holi isn't just fire and purification. It's flirtation, joy, and affection. Underneath the celebration is a spiritual message: the cycle of seasons, the resilience of the soul, and the beauty in embracing impermanence. Because after the flames die down and the colors fade from your skin, what remains is the lesson. Holi was always trying to teach light returns. Joy is sacred, and rebirth is always just around the corner. Amid the thunder of Roman armies and the pomp of imperial parades, there existed a ritual so secret, so exclusive, that even Rome's most powerful men were banned from attending. No senators, no priests, no emperors, only women. This was the festival of Bonadea, the good goddess, held each December at the home of Rome's highest magistrate. The festival was both religious and mysterious, honored a goddess associated with fertility, healing, chastity, and the earth. But her exact origins and functions remain elusive, and that's by design. Everything about Bonadea was cloaked in feminine secrecy. The rites were conducted by the Vestal Virgins, Rome's most sacred priestesses, and attended only by elite Roman women. Men were strictly forbidden, not just from participating, but even from knowing the rituals. In fact, not even male historians knew what happened during the ceremony. What we do know comes from scandal in 62 CE. The festival exploded into public controversy. That year, Julius Caesar, then Pontifex Maximus, was hosting the rites in his home as required, even though he couldn't attend, but his wife Pompeia was in charge of hosting the female-only celebration. Things took a turn when Heraclius aristocrat named Publius Caius Pulchar disguised himself as a woman and sneaked into the ceremony allegedly to seduce Pompeia. He was caught. A trial followed, turning a private sacred ritual into a public spectacle. Although Caius was acquitted, likely through bribery, Caesar divorced Pompeia, famously declaring that Caesar's wife must be above suspicion. But beyond scandal, the Bonadea festival reveals something rare: a sacred space entirely controlled by women, where their concerns, fertility, health, family, the rhythms of the body were placed at the center of religious life. It was a moment when Rome's rigid patriarchy stepped aside, and the divine feminine reigned. In secret wreaths of myrtle were banned, a symbol of Venus and possibly sexual love. Wine was disguised as milk. Music, incense, and offerings were made. Perhaps even symbolic fertility rites, but no man ever saw them. No man ever would. And maybe that's the point. In a world that documented everything, the most powerful rituals were the ones no one wrote down, because sometimes the sacred must, long before alchemy became synonymous with medieval quests to turn lead into gold, its roots lay deep in the temples and tombs of ancient Egypt. But in Egypt, it wasn't called alchemy. It was chemia, the black art. This name didn't refer to anything sinister, but to the rich, fertile soil of the Nile Valley, known as Kemet, the Black Land. To the Egyptians, transformation was sacred. It wasn't just about matter, it was about the soul. Egyptians were already masters of early chemistry. They created cosmetics, perfumes, dyes, glass, and metal alloys. They also developed sophisticated embalming techniques using resins, salts, and linen to preserve bodies for eternity. But these weren't just medical practices. They were spiritual rituals. Each act of mummification or pigment grinding was part of a cosmic process, preparing the soul for rebirth in the afterlife. Death itself was seen as an alchemical operation. Just as metals were purified by fire, the soul had to undergo trials in the underworld. The Book of the Dead, filled with spells and incantations, served as a guide for this journey of spiritual transformation. Central to this worldview was Thoth, the ibis-headed god of wisdom, writing, and sacred knowledge. When Greek and Egyptian cultures merged during the Ptolemaic era, Thoth was identified with the Greek god Hermes, forming the mythical figure Hermes Trismegistus. He would later be credited with authoring the Hermetic texts, mystical writings, that laid the foundation for alchemy as a spiritual science. These texts taught not just material transmutation, but divine unity. The belief that the microcosm reflects the macrocosm, as above, so below. In Egyptian thought, the transformation of base metals into gold symbolized the refinement of the self. True alchemy began not in the laboratory, but in the heart. Persian alchemy, fire and moral transformation. While Egypt gave alchemy its spiritual rituals, ancient Persia gave it a moral framework, a cosmology rooted in the eternal battle between light and darkness. Long before medieval laboratories emerged, Zoroaster, Zarathustra, laid out a dualistic vision of the universe, a struggle between Ahura Mazda, the god of light and truth, and Angra Mainyu, the spirit of chaos. Zoroastrians worshipped through fire, a living symbol of purity and divine insight. In their temples, sacred flames were kept perpetually lit. Fire didn't just purify metal, it revealed truth and dispelled falsehood, much like the alchemist's furnace would centuries later. Persians were among the first to refine copper, gold, silver, and iron. Their craftsmen were more than metallurgists. They were initiates perfecting nature. Smelting ore into gleaming metal wasn't just industry, it was cosmic alignment. Even pre-Islamic Persian medical texts reveal proto-alchemical thinking. Minerals, plants, and metals were listed for their effects on the body, not just to heal, but to harmonize with the universe's divine structure. Later, Islamic scholars would preserve and expand Persian alchemical ideas. But even before Islam, a crucial theme had emerged. All matter held within it a seed of perfection. With refinement, through fire, intention, and wisdom, it could be transformed. Persian alchemy was thus not only about materials, but about moral purification. Fire didn't just melt, it revealed the divine spark hidden inside. Greek alchemy, philosophy, form, and cosmic order. If Egypt gave alchemy sacred ritual and Persia gave it ethical depth, ancient Greece tried to explain it. With logic and philosophy, Greek thinkers inherited the mysticism of Egypt and Persia and attempted to organize it. At the heart of Greek alchemical theory was Empedocles' concept of the four elements: earth, water, air, and fire. These were not just substances, but building blocks of all matter. Change was seen as the rearrangement of these elements. Plato added metaphysical structure. He imagined matter as built from ideal geometric forms. Alchemy, then, became a quest to mirror these divine ideals. Aristotle expanded the idea further. He proposed that all matter had four qualities: hot, cold, wet, and dry, and that changing these qualities could change the substance. Lead, being, heavy and dull, could be made into gold by altering its qualities to make it balanced and luminous. In Hellenistic Alexandria, a city where Egyptian mysticism, Greek rationalism, and Babylonian astrology mingled, alchemy became both science and sacrament. This is where the legendary figure Hermes Trismegistus emerged. The Hermetic corpus attributed to him blended spiritual philosophy with early chemistry. These texts spoke of purifying both the soul and matter. Alchemy in Alexandria was not just experimental. It was symbolic. The crucible was the body, the fire, the soul's inner torment, the vapor, the divine essence. Mary the Jewess, one of the earliest known alchemists, invented devices still in use today, such as the double boiler, bain-marie, and distillation tools. Zosimos of Panopolis, another key figure, wrote of dreams and spiritual trials as part of the alchemical process. Greek and Alexandrian alchemists believed that transforming metals reflected the potential to transform the self. Their work blurred the lines between science and spiritual initiation. Islamic alchemy, systematizing the sacred. When the Great Library of Alexandria fell and Europe slipped into the early Middle Ages, it was the Islamic world that became the steward of alchemical knowledge. During the Islamic Golden Age, 8th–13th centuries, cities like Baghdad, Cairo, and Cordoba flourished with scientific inquiry. Greek, Persian, and Indian texts were translated into Arabic, and among them were alchemical writings. But Islamic scholars didn't merely preserve alchemy, they revolutionized it. Enter Jabir ibn Hayyan, known in the West as Geber, an 8th century polymath in Kufa. Often considered the father of chemistry, Jabir merged Greek elemental theory with Persian metaphysics and Islamic cosmology. He introduced a structured, experimental methodology. He believed all metals were made of two principles: sulfur, combustion and change, and mercury, fluidity and volatility. If you could balance these, you could transmute metals. Jabir introduced distillation, crystallization, sublimation, filtration, and calcination, techniques still used in chemistry today. His instruments became standard in medieval laboratories. But for Islamic alchemists, transformation wasn't only physical, it was spiritual. Alchemy was a path to understanding divine order. Purifying matter mirrored purifying the soul. Later, thinkers like Al-Razi, Rhazes, defended alchemy's practical medical uses, while Ibn Sina, Avicenna, criticized transmutation, but respected alchemy's ethical and philosophical dimensions. Muslim scholars turned alchemy into proto-chemistry, a discipline of logic, spirit, and experiment. And when their writings reached Europe, a new chapter began. Remain unseen, protected by silence, and passed down only through whispered. In the early stages of its development, alchemy was both mystical and practical. Later thinkers like Al-Razi, Rhazes, and Ibn Sina, Avicenna, debated its legitimacy. Al-Razi advocated for alchemy, emphasizing its usefulness in medicine, while Ibn Sina doubted the possibility of transmuting metals, but acknowledged alchemy's philosophical and ethical value. Even in disagreement, these scholars elevated alchemy beyond secret rituals. It became a blend of early chemistry, metaphysics, spiritual practice, and moral inquiry. When European scholars rediscovered these Arabic texts during the 12th century, thanks to translation centers in places like Toledo and Sicily, alchemy was reborn in the West. The soul of this practice, the belief that matter and spirit mirrored each other, had been preserved and clarified by Muslim scholars. In their hands, alchemy evolved from myth into early science. With the arrival of Arabic works by Jabir ibn Hayyan, Al-Razi, and Avicenna into Latin Europe, medieval thinkers were captivated. Europe, then emerging from intellectual stagnation, embraced these mysterious texts filled with cryptic symbols, unfamiliar substances, and promises of transformation. Alchemy became more than a quest for gold. It became a pursuit of power, wisdom, and immortality. The philosopher's stone came to symbolize both material perfection and spiritual enlightenment. Figures like Albertus Magnus and Roger Bacon, friars and scientists alike, believed that nature encoded divine secrets and that alchemy was a tool to decipher them. For these thinkers, alchemy was not sorcery. It was a form of Christian natural philosophy, a way to understand God's creation. Medieval laboratories filled with crucibles, alembics, and furnaces resembled sacred cloisters. Alchemists recorded their experiments in allegorical language, obscuring their work behind dense symbolism. Yet beneath this veil, genuine experimentation was taking place. Influential writers like Pseudo Geber adapted Arabic teachings for European audiences, while Arnauld of Villanova bridged alchemy and medicine, crafting elixirs to restore health and vitality. Far from being fringe, alchemy was debated in universities, supported by nobles, and practiced by clergy. Though some pursued it for gold, many sought deeper truths, balancing faith, fire, and philosophy in the pursuit of transformation. As Europe transitioned into the Renaissance, alchemy didn't fade. It changed. It became more esoteric and symbolic, blending Hermetic philosophy, Christian mysticism, and Renaissance humanism. This gave rise to one of the most mysterious movements in alchemical history, the Rosicrucians. In the early 1600s, anonymous manifestos like Fama Fraternitatis, Confessio Fraternitatis, and the chemical wedding of Christian Rosenkreutz began to circulate. They told of a secret brotherhood founded by the mythical Christian Rosenkreutz who had journeyed east in search of sacred knowledge. Whether or not the Rosicrucians existed physically was irrelevant. They became a powerful symbol. To Rosicrucian thinkers, alchemy was not about turning lead into gold. It was about spiritual enlightenment. Transmuting metals symbolized the transformation of the soul. The philosopher's stone was not a substance, but a state of Christ consciousness and inner rebirth. Their writings called for a hidden spiritual revolution, a reformation of science, religion, and politics. They offered no leaders or addresses, only the symbolism of the rose, beauty and secrecy, and the cross, sacrifice and transformation. Alchemy had become a spiritual allegory, its truths veiled and earned only through personal transformation. Its influence reached far. Isaac Newton studied Rosicrucian texts, and Johann Valentin Andrea, thought to be the author of The Chemical Wedding, envisioned the whole story as metaphor. By then, alchemy had fractured into layers. For some, it was material, for others mystical. But to the Rosicrucians, it was a spiritual path in disguise. As the 17th century progressed, alchemy began blending with the emerging field of modern science. But the transition wasn't abrupt. Many early scientists still clung to alchemical beliefs. Isaac Newton, revered for his laws of motion and gravitation, spent more time on alchemical experiments than on physics. He believed the universe was a divine machine, and that alchemy was the key to unlocking its hidden laws. Robert Boyle, often called the father of modern chemistry, published The Skeptical Chymist in 1661, challenging classical ideas about matter. But he too dabbled in alchemy, believing in the possibility of transmutation. What changed was the method. Modern science demanded clarity, repeatability, and empirical evidence. Alchemy's language of mysticism gave way to measurable, testable chemistry. Yet the tools and techniques of alchemy, retorts, crucibles, furnaces, formed the backbone of chemical labs. The dream of alchemy, transforming matter, never truly died. It simply evolved, now grounded in atoms and molecules rather than symbols and spirits. By the 18th century, alchemy was dismissed as pseudoscience, but history isn't that neat. Modern science stands on alchemical foundations, and the alchemists, with their coded texts and wild ambitions, were not merely chasing gold, they were asking a timeless question: can the world be changed? That question still drives science today. Even in the 19th century, alchemy found new life, not in labs, but in psychology, literature, and art. One of its most unexpected inheritors was Carl Jung, the Swiss psychiatrist. To Jung, alchemy was a symbolic representation of the human psyche. He saw the alchemical process, calcination, dissolution, fermentation, coagulation, as metaphors for psychological growth. The philosopher's stone symbolized self-actualization, the integration of the self. Alchemy, Jung believed, was the original form of therapy, a spiritual tradition disguised as protochemistry. Its goal wasn't to make gold, but to heal the soul. Today, alchemy lives on in literature, from Faust to fantasy novels, in spirituality, as a metaphor for personal transformation, and even in nuclear physics, where elements can quite literally be transmuted. The alchemists were wrong in their methods, but not in their belief that matter could change. Culturally, we still pursue alchemical dreams, the search for miracle cures, eternal youth, and the hidden knowledge that might elevate humanity. Alchemy endures not because of its failed recipes, but because of its imagination, its belief that the base can become noble, that transformation is possible, and that knowledge can elevate both matter and soul. Alchemy didn't die. It evolved, it became chemistry, psychology, story, symbol. And in many ways, it became you. Because every time you suffer, grow, refine, and emerge transformed, you are performing your own kind of alchemy. Not in gold, but in spirit. If you like this video, subscribe this channel for more interesting videos.